Now, our next guest, George Papadopoulos, is a former member of the Foreign Policy Advisory Panel to Donald Trump's 2016 presidential campaign. On October 5th, 2017, George Papadopoulos pleaded guilty to making false statements to the FBI, and he served 12 days in federal prison. Outsiders fans will remember that during that period, or shortly after, his wife Simona came on the show, and she believes it was a case of entrapment. Fans will also remember that Mark Steyn has twice appeared on Outsiders to discuss the extraordinary tale of George Papadopoulos and Alexander Downer. Last year, George released his book, Deep State Target: How I Got Caught in the Crosshairs of the Plot to Bring Down President Trump, which I think is a pretty self-explanatory title. And only last week, George did a very lengthy, in-depth interview on Rudy Giuliani's Common Sense YouTube show, in which the former mayor of New York forensically quizzed George Papadopoulos on every single detail of his story, right down to the watered-down gin and Downer's mannerisms. So you can watch that. It's fascinating viewing. Remember also, as we reported last week here, there are more and more revelations coming out in what is being called Obamagate, but is basically the plot, what appears to be the plot, to set up Trump as being in collusion with the Russians. Something that we on Outsiders told you from day one and never faltered, unlike the rest of the Australian media. We told you from day one that was garbage. Now, I hasten to point out that when asked about George Papadopoulos' claims, which we will come on to in a second with George, when asked about them, including here on Sky with Chris Kenny, Alexander Downer has vehemently denied the claims and has laughed them off as fanciful James Bond stuff. George Papadopoulos, welcome to Outsiders. George, so you've written your book on the...
It's a great pleasure to be on your show.
It's good to have you here. So talk us through... I don't want to go into all the fine detail which you went in with Rudy Giuliani. People can look at that and study that for themselves. It's a terrific view. What I want to get to is, what is your basic allegation against Alexander Downer and that notorious meeting in the wine bar? Sorry, can you hear us, George? We've frozen. George is frozen. Ooh, conspiracy theorists will have some fun with that one. Rita. Rita.
The conspiracy theorists are going to think Alexander's behind
this. Is James Bond stuff, James. James Bond stuff. We'll be trying to get him back in a second. You're familiar, James, with the story. So with Rudy Giuliani, he went through in very great detail about the basic story, but the gist of it seems to boil down to the fact that George Papadopoulos was working for the Trump team. This is before the election, remember, some months before the election, and he was, for all sorts of reasons, ends up in a wine bar with Alexander Downer and a young woman who works for Alexander Downer, and it appeared that in that meeting, which George says he had no real idea why he was there, two things appeared to be of consequence to George Papadopoulos and his claims. One was that he alleges that Alexander Downer was recording him on his phone. Well, Alexander Downer may have been reading his texts. Who knows? But that's one of the allegations. The other a suggestion is that Alexander Downer was trying to plant this idea on, or get this information from Papadopoulos, that he had information, that the Russians had information on Hillary Clinton. And anyway, the upshot of this was that this critical claim that the Russians had dirt on Hillary Clinton wound up being sent to the Americans from the Australian High Commission, and this kick-started the entire Russia hoax. James, you're over all these details. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, it's an interesting story, and I really do want to find out more about it, because it does seem very curious.
Hopefully we will.
why Alexander Downer was going out to this wine bar with George Papadopoulos.
Okay.
But, you know, the things that really kicked that investigation for not just Downer's cable, but also that BuzzFeed story, which came from the fake dossier that actually was paid for by the Hillary campaign. So there's so much to this, but really where it all comes to is that, you know, as we said on the show since the beginning, we always knew that the idea that the president was a Russian agent was complete nonsense. But what we're also seeing come out now is more and more evidence that the Democrats politicized the FBI and the Justice Department under the Obama administration and straight through the Trump administration to try and bring down a sitting president, which to me is a fundamental assault on American democracy that people should be incredibly concerned about.
Thanks, James. Well, as I say, Alexander Downer has strenuously always denied all the allegations that George Papadopoulos makes. Bear that in mind as we go now to George Papadopoulos. Hi, George. You're still with us?
Hi, thank you for having me.
Great.
Yes,
so we were
technical difficulty.
No problem. We've been talking about the case. Now, just get to the heart of what's your central allegation about what happened at that meeting in that wine bar?
Well, let's look at facts. After this meeting and after I had some meetings with the U.S. government, including the FBI, Congress, and the special counsel, I reported Alexander Downer for his increasingly bizarre and suspicious behavior at this meeting or alleged meeting I had with him at a bar in London, where I thought that he was either recording my conversation or directing a conversation into a manner to essentially entrap me with something that I had nothing to do with. That's the central claim I've made about Alexander Downer. My testimony to the U.S. Congress is now public. Anybody could simply read it from a couple of years ago. But what's even more suspicious, and I think what people are now looking into even more so than this meeting, is what was actually happening in the weeks before I met Alexander Downer in London.
George, you talk about, on the Rudy Giuliani lengthy interview, you mentioned a couple of things which I found interesting, which I hadn't heard before. Two things. One, you claimed that Alexander Downer was quite belligerent towards you about Donald Trump. And sort of, he's invited you to the wine bar, you're having a drink, and he knows that you're working for Trump, but he starts really aggressively, in your words, allegedly, going on about Trump. That was one of the things. And the other was your revelations that Malcolm Turnbull's book, which I have to confess I haven't read, did refer to the incident and distances Malcolm Turnbull from whatever Malcolm Turnbull thinks happened on those occasions. So, on that occasion, tell us, George, about how, in your opinion, Alexander Downer behaved in the meeting in the wine bar.
Yes, we can't forget there was one country that had castigated the candidate at the time for his Muslim ban comments that we were floating as a campaign at the time, and that was David Cameron, who was the then Prime Minister of the UK. And around May 1st or 2nd, 2016, I was living in London at the time. I gave an interview to the Times of London where essentially I mentioned that David Cameron should retract those comments because that's unbecoming of a sitting prime minister to speak of any candidate running for the U.S. presidency's office. So a couple days after that interview, that's when the UK government made contact at a very high level, including with Tobias Ellwood, who, if you know who this individual is, he was the number 2 under Boris Johnson at the time. The U.S. State Department makes contact. Then the Australian government makes contact for the 3rd time in 2 weeks at that point. So leading up to the meeting with Downer was even more bizarre than the actual wine bar meeting, where I guess we both didn't like each other's company and we both reported one another to the U.S. government in some shape or form.
So, Rita.
Well, putting aside the bizarreness, I would think, of the Australian High Commissioner wanting to have a drink with someone who, I don't want to insult you, but you weren't the most senior position within the Trump campaign. That in itself, I guess, raises a few eyebrows. But I want to ask you about what you inadvertently became a part of. Do you believe there was a coup to remove a sitting president?
the fact is there's an ongoing criminal investigation looking into the coup narrative, if you will. I think people who are following the evidence believe that there was an attempted coup against a sitting president in an effort to sabotage his presidential campaign. And the evidence that I'm talking about are that the leaders of the FBI and some under the Department of Justice under Obama are now under criminal investigation for their conduct. And even people like Alexander Downer, Erica Thompson, and some of these other individuals who are bumping into me in London and other capitals around the world have also been interviewed by this new special investigator looking into the Russian hoax, if you will. So I go by facts, not by innuendo and no gossip from myself, because it's not helpful. And I just go by exactly what happened at these meetings that I lived and I was at, and report what I felt was something that shouldn't have been happening.
Well, George Papadopoulos, fascinating stuff. You can read the book, Deep State, by George Papadopoulos. As I said before, Alexander Downer does deny allegations that you've put. That's up for the public to decide who they believe. Thanks so much for coming on Outsiders today, George Papadopoulos.